This is Tao Chow with MTG Forge, and first of all, I want to apologize because my voice is really bad. I've been really sick this week, and so I've almost lost my voice. But I still wanted to do a video for you guys today. And today what I wanted to talk about was setting a win condition for your deck. So when you're building a deck, we've talked about setting up the kind of deck that you want, but I think the most important thing is to set up a consistent win condition. And there's a lot of different kinds of win conditions, and I thought I'd show you a few and talk about them by showing them in a few different decks. So the first one I wanted to talk about was in Pauper Affinity. So Pauper Affinity is a very cheap deck. Of course, everything in Pauper is a cheap deck, but it kind of has an interesting sort of mechanic. Now, the one thing you want to have is a main win condition. So your main win condition in Pauper Affinity is to just power out creatures like Mirror Enforcer and Frogmite. Now, they have unbelievably high casting costs, but they also have affinity for artifacts. And because affinity can pump out so many cheap artifacts so quickly, and also in Pauper, your lands actually count as artifacts as well, you can get these out really, really fast. Usually faster than your opponent can expect, and then you can just pretty much attack them straight out. Basically, what you're doing, though, is you're just going with a straight-up fast aggro type of deck. So this is an aggro type of attack. Now, you have to think, though, what happens if this doesn't work? And a lot of people ignore this when they're building their decks, and that's why you have to include a secondary win condition. Okay, so how are you going to win if you can't win this way? Now, Pauper Affinity has another way of winning, and that's through ATOG. Okay, so ATOG is 2 mana for a 1/2, sacrifice an artifact. ATOG gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So what you can do is you can attack with ATOG, and if your opponent doesn't block, what you can do is sacrifice all of your artifacts, pump him up huge, and then just kill your opponent in one shot. Now, if your opponent does block, there's options. For instance, like you could cast Fling. Okay, and Fling, then you could sacrifice all your artifacts again, make ATOG huge, and then fling him. Okay, so Fling deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to the target creature or player, so you can overcome their defenders that way. So Pauper Affinity is a pretty easy deck to play. There's a lot of ways that you can win. Okay, and it makes for a more fun experience. Okay, there's lots of great cards in here, like Carapace Forger as well. So Metalcraft, and everything kind of works together. Okay, so the primary win condition is Carapace Forger, Frogmite, and Mirror Enforcer just coming out super quick to beat them down. And then failing that, we have ATOG and Fling as a secondary win condition. So that's pretty much how Pauper Affinity works. Let's look at something similar. Let's go to Elves. Okay, so Pauper Elves. Now, Pauper Elves basically wants to get a whole ton of elves out really, really fast. In that way, it's very similar to Affinity. Now, what we do is we have tons of things like Nettle Sentinels and Birchlore Rangers that basically allow you to get a ton of mana really fast. And then eventually what you're going to do is you're going to attack, and when one of your elves gets through, you tap your Timberwatch elf, and you basically target the elf that got through, that was not blocked, and he gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of elves you control. And that's usually pretty easy to go for lethal, usually in 3 to 5 turns. Okay, so one thing I should mention is that when we're setting our win conditions, we need to talk about or think about how fast this can work. Okay, so some win conditions are really, really horrible. I'll show you one that I was working on. Okay, so I was working on one, where is it here? It was Biofog. There it is. Okay, this is kind of a failed deck that I kind of still am working on, but I don't think it's going to work. And what the idea is to cast Biorhythm when your opponent has no creatures on the table and you have one creature. So each player's life total becomes the number of creatures he or she controls. And so the idea is to try and ramp your mana. So I've got things like Utopia Sprawl and Arbor Elf to try and ramp my mana to get Biorhythm out as quickly as possible. And basically trying to fog my opponent by using things like Fog and Defend the Hearth, and then board wipe the opponent. So the idea is use Fog to defend yourself, until you can cast Thing in the Ice or Supreme Verdict, board wipe your opponent, preferably Thing in the Ice, because Thing in the Ice would board wipe your opponent and then leave just itself on the battlefield, because it board wipes you as well, except for itself, and then cast Biorhythm and win the game. Now, the problem with this is that you can't, even with the ramp, I found that you can't really cast Biorhythm until like turn 5 or 6 at least, and by that time it's very, very difficult for you to actually achieve this win condition. So that's why I haven't really played this deck very much. I consider it a failed deck idea, but it's still an idea. The other thing is that there's not really a good secondary win condition. All we've got is Thing in the Ice and Biorhythm, and besides that there's nothing else that you can really do. So, well, if people have ideas, throw some comments in the comments field. I'd like to hear ideas about this, because I'd love to make this deck work. I just can't think of a way to actually get it going. So, this is an example of a win condition that just won't work. Okay, so far we've talked about some aggro win conditions. Let's go back to Pauper, and we'll see something different here. So let's go over to Mill. Okay, so if we're looking at Mill, let's pull this up here. All right. Now, obviously, the main win condition of Mill is to try and mill out your opponent by getting them to put cards from their library into their graveyard. Now, again, what do you do if that doesn't work? Okay, so for instance, what if your opponent has got an Emrakul in their deck and it just keeps putting everything back into their library? You have to have a way to winning besides that. Now, this deck has a couple different ways it can win. Now, the first ones are Thing in the Ice and Jace's Phantasm. Now, those two cards can actually just beat down your opponent, so you can actually focus more on the beatdown than you are on milling, and you can just mill them at the same time, but really try and focus on that. A clever thing I saw, and actually someone suggested it in the comment section of a different video, not one of mine, but I think it's brilliant, is to include Laboratory Maniac into the sideboard. And I actually thought it was a really, really good idea, and it's kind of an interesting approach. So what Laboratory Maniac says is if you would draw a card with your library has no cards in it, you win the game. So the approach then is to actually not to mill your opponent, but rather mill yourself. So for instance, if your opponent has got an Emrakul in their graveyard or in their library, and that's going to, every time that goes into the graveyard, it's going to shuffle the whole graveyard back into the library. You have a couple ways of dealing with that, but a clever approach, or another one, is if you're playing a mirror match against a mill deck, you can get sideboard Laboratory Maniac in and just work on milling yourself. Now, at first your opponent's not going to realize what you're doing, because you're not going to want to play Laboratory Maniac right away. What you'll do is just mulligan until you hopefully get him into your hand, and then you just start milling yourself, and then usually in the turn or two before you mill yourself out, then you play Laboratory Maniac, and then you can win the game straight out. Okay, so you can see, and even in a mill deck, there's multiple win conditions. All right. Now, the problem or a consideration is not to have something that's totally unrealistic. Okay, so please make sure that you have something that can actually be achieved and something that synergizes well with your deck. Let's take a look at Phuket. This is actually one of my favorite decks. I love playing this deck because it's so much fun. Okay, so Phuket has a couple different win conditions. One is mainly to use Puka's Mischief to take over all your opponent's cards. Okay, so to take over their win conditions and use their win conditions against them. I think that's brilliant, and I really love that. But failing that, we have alternate win conditions. Our alternate win conditions are just beating down with Salt Skidder and Bronze Bombshell. Okay, and failing that, another win condition is just basically to use Venser, okay? And using Venser, once we ultimate him, we can just start destroying exiling all of our opponent's permanents. Okay, so once you see this deck get going, it starts eliminating all the opponent's lands, all their artifacts and creatures and stuff like that. Anytime they play anything good, you just trade it back to them for something that's terrible that you have, and it just frustrates the hell out of them. But it makes it a really good deck because it has multiple lines of winning. Okay, so let's take a look at a deck that doesn't have that. Okay, so a good deck, let's go over to Pauper here, is Bogle's. Okay, so Bogle's doesn't really have a strong, well, it has a very strong win condition, but it's kind of an all-in approach. Okay, so what that means is that Bogle's is just seeking to attack on one line, and it just wants to win with that one line. Okay, so what you have is, with Bogle's, you got things like Silhana Ledgewalker, Slippery Bogle, and Glade Cover Scout. Okay, they're basically all the same type of creature. Okay, so they're just 1/1 hexproof. Silhana Ledgewalker is a little bit better because she can't be blocked except by creatures with flying. Now, and then what you're trying to do with Bogles is just attach a whole crap load of enchantments onto it so that you can beat down and you can just win with one big, huge beater. Now, a key for this is to use a card like Rancor. Okay, so because it gives it trample, so you can't just be chump blocked anymore. And other ones are like Armadillo Cloak. Okay, so it gives you life gain and trample. And then the key ones are Ethereal Armor. Normally Daybreak Coronet would go in here, but that's not a common, so you can't play it in Pauper. Okay, but those cards, or actually Ancestral Mask is a really great one as well. Okay, but those cards basically allow you to attack this, or you pump up this creature and just make it huge really, really fast. Now, the problem is that what if your opponent plays something like Chainer's Edict? Okay, so forces you to sacrifice that creature. Well, hopefully you have things like Colony Garden played, so you have a creature that can be sacrificed. But if you don't, then you lose your Bogle, and then basically you just lost the game. Okay, so this type of deck has what's called an all-in approach to its win condition. It only has one win condition, and it just seeks to exploit that and nothing else. Okay, it's really, really fragile. But it can be very explosive when it does win. Okay, the last one I'm going to look at is Green Tron. Okay, so Green Tron is another good popper deck. Basically, what it's trying to do is, again, just do a beatdown with Fangren Marauder. Okay, and things like Maul Splicer. When Maul Splicer dies, see, people don't want to kill Maul Splicer because it creates 2/3/3 colorless golem artifacts. Okay, and then things like when artifacts die, they go into the you get 5 life when they go into the graveyard. Okay, here you can search for other creatures or whatever, but mainly it's just trying to get these two creatures out to try and beat down your opponent. Okay, but it does have a secondary win condition. The secondary win condition is to use Ulamog's Crusher. Okay, so we have Fierce Empath that can help to search that out. And Ulamog's Crusher essentially just attacks. It's an 8/8, so it's huge. But it also has Annihilator too, so your opponent has to sacrifice 2 permanents every time he attacks. Okay, and there's been games when you can have like 2 or 3 of these out, and it just destroys your opponent really, really fast. Right, so that's pretty much all I've got to say about win conditions. There's so many different win conditions. Actually, before I go, I'll just show one more, because it's kind of a different one here. Okay, and that one is, where is it here? Soul Sisters. Okay, so Soul Sisters. Now, I am splashing green in my Soul Sisters, mainly because I think that Rancor and, or like basically Rancor and Sundering Growth and things like that are totally worth it. Okay, so what I have is cards. Like, your main goal in Soul Sisters is to use cards like Ajani's Pridemate, Squadron Hawk, and stuff like that to beat down your opponent. Okay, you're trying to use those creatures to attack, but you also have another win condition, which is in Felidar Sovereign. Okay, so at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 40 or more life, you win the game. Okay, so if your beaters like Serra Ascendant and everything can't do the job for some reason, you always can win with a Felidar Sovereign, and that's why that card is in there. It's not because it's just such a great card. Like a 4/6 for 6 is okay, but really, this is what's going to let you win if you get stuck. So that's what I have to say about win conditions. So when you're first building your deck or a deck idea, what I would do is look through the cards that you have and find cards that are interesting and say, you know what, that's how I'd like to win the game. Okay, then once you have that, think about cards or look for other cards that could support that as a secondary win condition. So saying, look, if my opponent's able to disrupt this win condition somehow, how else can I win? Is there another way for me to get to the victory? Okay, by doing that, you're not going to have such a brittle deck, okay? So you won't have like a fragile deck that can be easily disrupted, especially in sideboarding. You see this a lot in Magic the Gathering Online when people play single matches. What they have is often they're playtesting or stuff like that, but many times you'll see people have like a really, really fragile deck. And you go and play them, and of course they might beat you in the first round because you're not expecting it. But then later on, you could actually sideboard against them, but you can't, and that's often why they choose to play a single match rather than a three match round, or 3-round match. Okay, so anyways, most Magic the Gathering games consist of 3 matches against each other, and you can sideboard in between them so you can prepare. Now, your opponent is going to prepare, so do make sure you have that secondary win condition. It's super important. So what are your favorite win conditions? Please leave a message in the comments, and remember to like and subscribe if you do enjoy these videos. I'd really love to hear what your favorite win conditions are and how you like to play. Like I said, my main win conditions are that I like to play mill or control, and like decks like Puka's Mischief really typify how I like to play. Okay, basically stalling out and stopping your opponent from doing what they can, and then just winning in a sort of methodical, slow way rather than an explosive win or something like that. But anyways, I'd love to hear from you guys, and remember, if you do like the videos, like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, hopefully with a better voice. It's that time again for Random Card Review, Sick Voice Edition. So let's take a look at a random card. Okay, Stingmoggy. Alright, so this is from Morningtide. One of my favorite blocks, actually. I love Morningtide and Lorwyn, that whole set. It's just really flavorful. But, okay, so Stingmoggy comes into play with 2+1/+1 counters on it. So it's basically a 2/2 for 4. For 4 more mana, so 3 and a red. Remove a +1/+1 from counter from Stingmoggy. Destroy target artifact or land. This one I'd say is not a very good card. I don't really like it. This might go well if you had something like Hardened Scales, where you could actually get extra counters on it. But to get a 2/2 for 4 is not really that great. It's I don't know, like to pay another 4 mana, then you have to make it into a 1/1, and then just to destroy target artifact or land. There's lots of other ways to destroy your opponent's stuff, like especially if you have something like Abrupt Decay, or even depending on your format, you could be playing Stone Rain or something like that. I think that this just isn't really worth the cost. Overall, though, like I guess if in a limited environment, I might pick it if I had nothing else. But I don't think this is a really good card. I think the 2 mana, like the 2-star rating, is probably appropriate for a card like this. And yeah, overall, it's just not that interesting. So, anyways, that's my card review. If you disagree, then let me know. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.